In a recent column in the Washington Post, noted scholar Robert Kagan, a senior fellow at the Washington-based Brookings Institution, wrote, "Whether one likes President Obama's conduct of foreign policy or not, the common assumption is that the administration is at least giving the American people the foreign policy they want." So when the US president's critics call for military intervention in Syria or Ukraine or more involvement in Egypt, Iraq or Afghanistan, just to name a few global hotspots, the administration can point to the sensibilities expressed by the American people in recent polls. The latest Wall Street Journal poll found that nearly half those surveyed want the United States to be less active on the global stage, a change from decades marked by US engagement in various conflicts. In a few moments, we'll talk with a former US State Department spokesman and an expert on US Latin America policy, and later the view from Europe and Asia. But we begin in our newsroom with CCTV's Nathan King. And Nathan, President Obama has a lot of foreign policy challenges, as was evident in his recent trip to Asia. He had to reassure the allies there that the US remains committed to their security, but while he was there at the same time, there were events unfolding in Ukraine that he had to respond to. What did you make of that trip and his responses? Did you see a foreign policy strategy here?
Well, let's first of all take the trip, and of course it was a trip he had to make. He'd put it off a couple of times because of domestic problems with the budget here in the United States before. And you're right, it was called the reassurance tour because allies had become nervous about US security treaties, especially in Japan and the Philippines, at a time of a rising China. He did what he had to do in terms of Japan's domestic opinion, re-invoking Article 5 of the treaty, even when it comes to disputed islands like the Diaoyu or the Senkaku Islands, as Japan calls them, and of course signed in the Philippines a 10-year military agreement that will see US forces basically back in that country for the first time since they were expelled in 1992. It'll be a very different force. So in a way, he did what he had to do, a part of the rebalance of Asia, but he didn't make progress on the economic leg of that three-legged stool, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big free trade deal. So a lot of pluses and minuses, but you know, that sound that we played at the top of the show there was really that got Washington and the world talking. It almost looked like a president complaining, and of course Ukraine did dominate the headlines. Is there an Obama foreign policy is the next part of the question, an Obama doctrine? Well, it's easier, I think, to talk about what he's not for than what he's for. He's not for the Bush years, which of course saw two large interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq with huge amounts of troops and treasure piled in. The new strategy when it comes to the rebalance of Asia is indicative. Small amounts of forces, not as expensive, being rotated in and out of countries. It doesn't look like bases, but they're certainly going to be in places. We see that also in the Eastern Europe in response to the Ukraine crisis. Look at just a few hundred troops that have been sent to Poland and the Baltic states, rotating in just a few hundred troops at a time, a message that we're here, that we back up our alliance partners, but it's not going to be the same sort of response that we saw in foreign policy when it comes to the Bush administration. Of course, that does fit in with what the public want. The Wall Street Journal poll says it. They want less foreign entanglements, not more, and certainly spend money here, not the $1 trillion spent in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right, Nathan, in many respects, this trip was also a bit of a balancing act as far as the president was concerned. He had to reassure allies that US remains committed to them, but at the same time not alienate China. Did he succeed?
No, you know, there was a talk in China that this was not a reassurance tour, but the containment tour. There has been a lot of pushing back on what the president has called the rebalance. It's largely called the pivot still in China. There is a real suspicion that US foreign policy may be dictating what they want is freedom of the seas in the South China Sea, international norms that the US, of course, created. But really, it's a bid to try and contain China in the South China Sea, especially with its maritime claims, and also to make sure that sovereignty claims the Diaoyu Islands and other islands with Japan and the Republic of Korea are at least managed and not necessarily have to be solved.
Just one quick point, Nathan, and this is about Russia's involvement in Ukraine. The Republican opposition senator here in the United States, John McCain, said that, and he was describing President Obama here, he says, "We have a weak and indecisive president that invites aggression." Was that fair?
Well, you know, he is a political opponent of the president, and also Ukraine is not a NATO member. And remember that anything that has to be done in Ukraine has to be done really in unison with the European Union. 28 members, the biggest of which, Germany, has a very different view on how to approach this crisis.
OK, thanks, Nathan. Nathan King there reporting.